United Nations major summit on climate change in Dubai is now over. And negotiators are saying that there was a big breakthrough on the need to get rid of gas and coal. Countries did agree on the need to move away from fossil fuels, but not all environmentalists are giving this a standing ovation because they point out that there are some pretty big loopholes in what was agreed to. Blair Feltmate is on the line right now. Blair is the head of the Intact Center on Climate Adaptation at the University of Waterloo. Great to have you on the show, Blair.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Overall, what's your opinion on what was accomplished here?
In my view, it was more positive than negative. And maybe I'll just give you a couple of positives and then one or two of the negatives. For example, as recognized by Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN, he saw a positive in the fact that for the first time, the world recognized the need to transition away from fossil fuels and actually put that language into the final communique. And that's the first time that that's been done coming out of a COP meeting. Some saw this as signaling or recognizing the beginning of the end of the fossil fuel era. The final communique called for a tripling of renewable energy and a doubling of energy efficiency around the world. So obviously that's a good thing. And a fund was created of about $800 million to help poor nations around the world better adapt to extreme weather, things like flooding and hurricanes and so forth. And by the way, that sounds like a big number, $800 million, but a couple of years ago in Calgary, one 20-minute high wind event caused $1.2 million in damage to buildings. So 800 million sounds like a lot, but compared to the damage realized due to climate change, it's better than not having 800 million, but it's not a lot. The weaknesses are that the agreement allows for the continued use of transition fuels, which is basically code for the continued use of natural gas, which when burnt gives off greenhouse gas emissions, less than coal and oil. So maybe that's positive, but it still is a fossil fuel-based resource. The deal calls for the transitioning away from fossil fuels and energy systems in a just, orderly, and equitable manner, which sounds good, but there's no rigorous enforcement of a transition schedule. And small island states came out very in strong agreement that they wanted a more aggressive statement to the phase out of use of coal, oil, and natural gas because they're the ones really bearing the brunt of extreme weather. So it's sort of a mixed bag of positives and negatives, and it's a matter of interpretation how much you read in one side of the equation versus another.
It's being called an unprecedented deal because of some of the accomplishments that you just cited. But back to one of your points where you were suggesting it's a bit watered down, it's not as big of a success as we might think. You mentioned the transition time. Is that transition time not to be expected because these big changes simply can't be made overnight?
That's right. I mean, basically, we have locked in systems for energy production that are very difficult to change in any short period of time. For example, in Canada, we still have 3 provinces that are very much dependent on coal-fired electricity generation for their electricity supply, Nova Scotia, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. And it takes a long time and a lot of money to rebuild those systems to get off coal. And generally speaking, the practical reality is you have to wait for those facilities to phase through their life cycle. For example, in Ontario, we got off of coal-fired electricity generation in 2014, but by and large, the coal-fired plants were at the end of their life, like they had it. And so it was time to build new generation capacity anyhow. So the end of their life coincided with the period in time in which we also said we want to be off coal. So that's the practical reality. And when countries around the world are carrying huge debt burdens, they simply don't have the money to make these transitions.
Isn't it a bit silly to hold the world's biggest climate summit in a country where oil and gas production is a huge deal? It's a mainstay of the economy. Was this the right venue?
It's an interesting question. I don't know if it was a brilliant move or if it was astronomically dumb, but it's probably at one end of the equation or the other. But the reality is, you have to engage those countries. So my sense, and I understand exactly what you're saying, but my sense would be that, I would probably meet them head on personally and even if it's on their own turf. Because at the end of the day, if they don't sign, you haven't got anything. So I think it probably put more pressure on them to perform with the eyes of the world looking at them, as opposed to if they were in Western Canada and sort of saying, well, we're not sure if we're going to commit to this or not. It wouldn't draw as much attention. So I'm not sure if it was a brilliant move or really, really dumb.
Great to chat with you today, Blair.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Blair Feltmate, who's the head of the Intact Center on Climate Adaptation, at the University of Waterloo.